now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Sheffield, in my district in North Texas, I've heard countless constituents, they complain, I mean, I feel it myself, about the cost of things. And that, like, for instance, I believe, roughly speaking, the average gasoline across the country was $2.39 when this administration took office. And it's now, depending on where you are, national average is about $5. Well, actually, it wasn't that. It was in June of last year. It's a little lower than that now. What examples like this would it say about the quote-unquote success or lack thereof of the Biden administration's economic policies?
Yeah, I would say just looking at the numbers, but going beyond the numbers as well, just talking to people that the headline inflation is certainly not actually how families feel and how they're actually experiencing when you're talking about food inflation, fuel inflation. My esteemed colleague, with all due respect, his graph that he has here when he's comparing the inflation to other countries, it excludes energy, food, and housing, which are pretty much what you need to survive. So would
it be fair to say those three things are main economic drivers?
Absolutely, and especially for the people that are in your district, that's the personal, it's their everyday life, and so that's why Bidenomics is failing them.
Mr. Anthony, what's been the impact of the expiration of the expanded child tax credit on poverty, and what has been the impact on inflation, the impact of inflation on poverty?
Thank you. In terms of inflation, well, I think we'll probably best to discuss that one first, because inflation is actually the only thing that can increase the poverty threshold. And so as inflation has outpaced earnings during the Biden administration, it has caused more people to fall below that poverty threshold. That is literally just what the numbers tell us. There is nothing else that can increase that poverty threshold. In terms of the expansion of the child tax credit, you would expect that once that went away, that you would simply return poverty rates for children to the level that they were at previously. But that's not what we've seen. We've instead seen the rate go much higher. And again, the reason for that is because inflation has pushed that threshold so high that many people's nominal earnings haven't kept pace with inflation and have therefore fallen below the threshold.
And while we're visiting, what's the impact of supply chain disruptions on inflation? Disruptions, rather.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of supply chains, the disruptions there, it's a very, well, let me put it this way, it's very similar to what we just said on poverty, in that if supply chains really were the only driver behind inflation, if it had nothing to do with fiscal and monetary stimulus, then once those supply chain issues were resolved, not just inflation would come down, but prices would come down. Prices would simply return to where they were previously, and that's not what we've seen at all. Actually, the last several reports from S&P Global, their Purchasing Manager Index that analyzes global supply chains, showed that there is no more pandemic-era impact in terms of supply chains. In other words, things are back to normal, and yet prices are not. And the reason for that is because the fiscal and monetary conditions today are not back to where they were.
So you're saying that there's an increased money supply, and the goods and services, the goods are out there. They remain steady. So when you have more money relative to the goods cost more. In very simplistic terms. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to wrap your mind around it. Now, is it true that real weekly earnings have exceeded inflation, the annual rate of inflation, for 26 of the 31 months of the Biden administration?
Yes, it is. You can see on page 6 of the testimony that I submitted, only the first 2 months of the Biden administration and now the most recent 3 months have seen positive annual real earnings compared to inflation. But in the 26 months in between, it was negative, which is a record.
Thank you. Mr. Mulligan, you're an expert in economic growth. That's one of the purviews, of course, of this committee, as well as regulatory reform, yet another purview of this committee. Before the pandemic hit, the Trump administration demonstrated some of the most pro-growth policies that we've seen in generations. How has the Biden administration policies reversed the possibility of growth, and what do we need to do right now to get on the right track and get our economy moving again?
All the policy levers have been pushed in the opposite direction of President Trump to the extent they could. President Trump had a tax cut that needs some renewing, I guess, and that might not happen. A lot of the regulations have been totally reversed. Not all of them. And both of these things go toward reducing productivity. Rather than productivity growing, you see, like you see in energy, where we're pumping more and more and more, we're less productive. We're less able to do what we used to do.
My time has expired. I yield to the ranking member for her 5 minutes of questions.